The U.S. and China talk past each other on most issues, but at least they're still talking. I was looking and I saw consistent news articles where it's showing a stream of American diplomats heading to China, trying to convince China that they should somehow agree or go along with the United States view of the world and go along with the United States plan for international relations. And in all of these attempts, of course, you already know what the outcome of these meetings were. Yellen went across and she tried to convince the Chinese that they should go along with the United States economic plans. Yellen says nothing off table in response to China overcapacity. She made a bunch of hardline stances and don't discredit Yellen. Janet Yellen has given some great advice to the administration. And I think she becomes a faithful soldier when needed, but she has advised the administration in multiple ways that their approach toward China and their approach towards international relations and geopolitics has not been accurate. But still and yet, the Biden administration, the hardliners have persisted. And so now they're waking up to this notion that not only do they need China, but that they have created a hostile relationship with China, one that leaves China in the catbird seat. China warns U.S. of downward spiral as Antony Blinken meets with Xi Jinping. In an earlier meeting Friday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Secretary of State Antony Blinken that negative factors were building in the relationship between the two superpowers. And indeed, these negative factors, many of them have been brought on by the actions of the United States. And these actions to try and to constrain, to contain China economically, to contain China and to force it to operate in ways that are counter to its own political self-defense and economic interest of its people. And by using these pressure tactics, China has responded not just masterfully, but they have responded in a way that has left them in the catbird seat. Let me give you 3 examples of how China has checkmated the U.S. as it relates to these issues of geopolitics and these issues of foreign relations. One, and the most significant, is the Russia-Ukraine war. When we look at it, and we look at not only the news articles that are now coming out that make it clear that China is in the catbird seat, that China has masterfully maneuvered itself into a position where it has become the player in the Ukraine war without having to actually incur many of the negative consequences that would have resulted from a direct intervention or the sending of military aid. They found the proper mix of assistance for Russia while still maintaining their stance and their ability to move around the global scene economically and to continue their buildup of their military and their economy. In Ukraine war, China is helping tilt momentum in Russia's favor. Top U.S. spy says it's clear to the West that Ukraine is losing this war. It is clear to everyone now. While the West knew this way earlier, the West knew 7-8 months. Actually, the West knew from the beginning that Ukraine would not be able to win. They told Ukraine as much after they goaded them and kind of pushed them into this conflict. But then they came back and said, we're going to be behind you all the way. We're going to help you all the way. And they've done as much as they could do. But with all of that help, they're still losing. And the reason they're losing is because while Russia may not have all of the allies that the U.S. has, the one ally they have that has the production capacity to tilt the scale on the battlefield, even without producing actual providing military equipment, by them providing dual purpose equipment, that is enough for Russia with its own manufacturing base to muster the strength to really repel the NATO assault that is taking place in Ukraine. DNI. Russia gaining ground in Ukraine with China's help. It's clear now that the only way to cripple Russia is to convince China to come along. But how do you convince a country that you have been attacking constantly over and over and over again? The Biden administration, the Trump administration, they have been singling out and using every method possible to militarily pressure China into compliance, economically pressure China into compliance. And because China has reached a level where it is too large and it is impervious to some degree of these pressure tactics, now the West is realizing, oh, wait a minute, we made an error. And China is really punishing us for this error, for this approach that we have taken in our relationships with them. China supporting Russia in massive military expansion, U.S. says. China is fueling the reconstruction of the military industrial complex of the old Soviet Union. They are providing the necessary equipment, the necessary technology that Russia needs to retool. The West should have thought more critically, the United States should have thought more critically about their efforts to curtail, to alienate, to sanction, to do export bans to China, because now they've taken, there's this old thing, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You can create a situation where you have alienated a group, where you have continuously pressured a group, where you have continuously done things that put your adversaries together. And by aligning their interests, you are creating your own united front. This Russia, China, Iran alliance did not exist when there was a nuclear treaty with Iran, when there was talks, and even though there had been some frictions and sanctions, there was still communications and open lines, and there was still the adherence to the one China policy. But all of that collapsed, and essentially what has been created is a united front against the West. That's what the West has created. That's what the United States has created by its own foreign policy, its own efforts to try to curtail China, to try to contain it. It's created its own opposition. Let's look at it. When we look at this, U.S. intelligence shows China is surging equipment sales to Russia to help war effort in Ukraine, AP says. And so this is what's going on. If you pressure them, if you alienate them, you drive them into the arms of your adversary, the one that you are directly in conflict with. And ultimately, it puts China in the catbird seat, to where if you want to win this war in Ukraine, you are going to have to create concessions. You are going to have to do something for China. They are the one calling the shots on the global stage as it relates to Ukraine. Yes, Russia has great capacity, but without China's support, Russian capacity would dwindle, and it would be unclear. I'm unsure that Russia would be able to muster the type of strength to make this war push that they are currently, this gaining of momentum they are currently undertaking, consistent and continuous. They need the help of China to do that. If they were standing alone, if there was no China, if there was no Iran, in particular those two countries, then this would be a grinding war. They tried to sell us. It's amazing how the media tries to sell us on things that they know are not true. They tried to sell us on the concept that the war was a stalemate. But after consistent weeks and weeks of military gains, even that argument has collapsed. They no longer can sell that nonsense to the general public. The reality is, going into the election season in the UK, in the United States, and in other Western countries, it will be clear to the populace that not only have we spent lots of money undergirding this foolish war, but we're also losing this foolish war. And the reason we're losing this foolish war is because we pick fights with too many different countries, and now they have coalesced around one another. Look at what the report says. China is helping Russia undertake its biggest military expansion since Soviet times, ramping up sales of machine tools, microelectronics, and other technology that Moscow is using to produce missiles, tanks, aircraft, and other weaponry for its war against Ukraine, according to a U.S. assessment. Now, this is not me making it up. Before you get a bunch of people in the comments dropping in that this is fake news and false news, you see the reports before you. You see what the U.S. assessment is. U.S. officials are hoping the release of the intelligence will encourage European allies to press China as the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz heads to Beijing this weekend and G7 foreign ministers meet next week in Italy. Essentially, everyone has come to the realization that they have made a strategic error in trying to alienate and harm China's economy and to militarily press China in the Indo-Pacific, as well as over the Taiwan issue. There was all of this bolster. We can do whatever we want. We can do whatever we want to do in Taiwan. We're superpowers, and we're the G7. We're NATO, and we won't be told where we can go and in whose backyard we can play in. Well, that didn't work in Ukraine, playing in Russia's backyard, and that's not working in China, in Taiwan, playing in China's backyard. And China is able to punish the West without actually using its own military. Just like the West is trying to weaken Russia, China inevitably, with the help of Russia directly, is weakening NATO and weakening the West. U.S. prepared to take further steps as it warns China against enabling Russia. How can you warn China when you're building military bases on their doorstep? How can you expect China to go along with your military plans, your defense structure of the world, when you're trying to surround it with United States military bases, when you're constantly trying to pressure it over its own territory? What was once accepted as U.S. foreign policy, the one China policy, you abandon that, and then you expect China to go along with your defense infrastructure, your world view on what the world should look like from a military, economic. It's ludicrous. U.S. takes aim at Chinese banks. So when the other sanctions, the technology sanctions, hadn't worked, now they're trying to sanction the banks. And this is not just China. They're sanctioning Indian companies. They're sanctioning companies around the world who choose to do business with Russia and who choose to help Russia. But the reality is they have made too many enemies. And this is where I say Janet Yellen was very smart. I did a video not too long ago where I showed the articles where Yellen was warning the administration not to use sanctions too broadly, not to make that the tool of diplomacy, because if you continuously sanction, what you end up with is a lot of countries that have the capacity to come together, as well as you end up with a situation where the sanctions are, countries become smarter at how to evade the sanctions. They become smarter in creating new networks, and you see these new networks forming. You see this push towards, I saw an article the other day, I probably will do a short video on it, of Trump saying that he's going to punish countries that move away from using the dollar for cross-border trade. Well, if you continue to sanction, embargo, export bans, if you continue those tactics, countries will move away from the dollar, which will weaken the ability to engage in the sanctions to begin with. So we saw that with Russia, we've seen that with Iran, and now we're seeing increasingly China in its financial sectors, China in its other sectors, moving away and insulating itself from the West. Blinken says China helping fuel Russian threat to Ukraine. And it's clear to everyone at this point that China has become the power behind the Russian military industrial complex. China helps Russia evade sanctions and likely most supplies tech used in Ukraine, U.S. report says. So the technology that's on the battlefield, they are weakening the United States militarily. They are weakening NATO military without having to fire one shot in Taiwan without having to fire one missile. They are, in effect, undermining the United States, its security and defense, but the United States' ability to support its allies and to engage in this imperial dream, this imperial desire, fetish that the West has. It is undermining it at the same time that it is keeping its distance and not losing anything, because all of what it's doing is selling. It's not giving these things away for free. It's selling these things to Russia. It's becoming a supplier. So not only is it improving its own economy, but it's also undermining the military capacity of these countries, as well as in the G7, it's undermining the military capacity of the NATO and G7 and the European allies. These European allies have not spent significant monies. They barely have spent their 2% quota in NATO on military and defense spending. And as a result, they're trying to ramp up aid to Ukraine while they're also trying to invest in the expansion of their military and defense industries, their production capacity. And because of this, now this is having negative externalities on these economies. The German economy, the French economy, my goodness, the UK economy cannot afford to be siphoning off money towards military interventions, towards military production, while the economies in Europe are struggling at best. And so this is another way that China has checkmated the U.S. and its Western allies. Yellen says U.S. economy strong, all options open on China's overcapacity. Instead of trying to produce goods, more goods at a cheaper price to compete with on the global stage, they're trying to pressure China not to produce as many goods and not to distribute as many products. That will never, ever work. As long as there's a market and there's individuals willing to buy, China will strive to meet the demand. And if you want to get a leg up in the global economy, you're going to have to produce more cheaper products. You can't do like the American car makers did. You know, you can't put out $100,000, $110,000 pickup truck and then complain when there's not enough buyers for that product. You can't put out $100,000 EV when China's selling them at a significantly reduced level and complain that you can't compete. You're going to have to compete. You know, we hear so much about in the West about capitalism and extolling the benefits of capitalism only when it benefits them. When it's situations where they are struggling or situations where they are at a disadvantage, especially in this instance with China, when it comes to EVs and all of the green technology, there's a complaint that someone's doing something wrong. Anytime there's this losing mentality, you know, it's kind of like when you're playing Monopoly as a kid, and when you start to lose, you turn over the Monopoly board, or you're playing basketball on the playground and you can't win, you can't get your way, you start making up new rules, and when that doesn't work, you grab your ball and run off to the house. That's how the West appears in this confrontation with China about producing goods and services for the global economy. Janet Yellen tackles China over a flood of cheap goods. I thought in capitalism, the goal was to produce cheap goods. I thought the individual that could have the highest quality with the lowest price was the one that should win the business. But we see that that's not the case in U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy, something else is supposed to happen. It's supposed to be capitalism, free market, when it advances the goals and agendas, when the right people are making money. But when the wrong people start making money and advancing, then there's an issue. Look at this. China has helped shift the battlefield momentum in Russia's favor in Ukraine by providing it with components and other material needed to sustain its defense industry. The reason I wanted to come back to this concept is because when you sanction a country, that country looks for other alternatives for the distribution of its goods and services. And so by sanctioning China, China then goes out and finds other partners to sell its products to, i.e. Russia. And so by attacking both of them simultaneously, One, both really through the pressing on their borders. You know, superpowers, and I think there's others who've explained this very well. These superpowers believe they have a sphere of influence for their security and defense. They do not want an adversarial nation on their border. And the United States pushing up to these countries' borders was a red line. It has always been a red line. The United States was sending weapons and other things to Ukraine, and now they've been sending them to Taiwan. Eventually, these countries will have enough. They will not allow themselves to be encircled by United States military bases, Western military bases. It won't happen. And they will not allow their economies to be undermined in the way that the U.S. is trying to do with the chip bans, the export bans, the tariffs. If you say you want free market, be free market. If you say you want a rules-based international order, have a rules-based international order. But you won't be able to put your thumb on the scale and then pretend that nothing is going on. They will not allow that. So what's happening is the United States is only by creating these bans forcing China to find other customers. And there are other customers partially because the United States has sanctioned other countries simultaneously. It is the most idiotic thing I can think of to try to do sanctions on multiple countries at the same time, not realizing that those countries will coalesce. You have created a market for Chinese goods in Russia. You've created a market for Chinese goods in Iran and throughout the global south. They are really creating a market for Chinese technology and goods, even in India and other countries that are because of some of the ways in which they have engaged in sanctions. Chip wars, the uncertain impact of U.S. sanctions on China's tech surge. The reality is, even after analyzing these sanctions and export bans for a year, they've gotten mixed reviews in their success, just like the oil cap on Russia. Mixed reviews, if any success, and there's several articles out saying that there was no success for these export bans. There's been no success for some of these other sanctions that the West has placed on Russia, but still and yet they drive Russia into the hands, right into the arms of China. U.S. urges allies to squeeze China further on chip technology. Instead of competing, instead of holding true to free market principles, all of this manipulation, all of this finagling that the West is doing, instead of trying to compete and invest and create a United States version of Plan 2025 or a United States infrastructure plan, not some cockamamie scheme that has a bunch of foolish pork and a foolish money's placed in it for ridiculous things, but a real, true investment that's focused on the benefit, that's focused on the quality of life of residents. Instead of doing that, their response to the perceived threat is more bans. But look, balancing the ledger, export controls on U.S. chip technology to China. Let's look at this a little bit. An initial assessment of recent attempts by the United States to limit or delay China's ability to acquire and produce advanced semiconductor technology reveals a mixed picture in a complex and rapidly evolving industry. On the one hand, new chip restrictions have significantly affected China's semiconductor ecosystem, limiting access to equipment essential for next-generation production. On the other hand, China is intensifying its domestic investment in more advanced chips while also reducing market shares of U.S. firms. So look at this. You put these bans and restrictions out there. All you're doing is hurting your companies, forcing China to develop the technology, and then by banning other countries like Russia, you create a market for China's entry-level products. These products that China is currently creating are not at the same quality and level of the United States. However, because Russia cannot buy the products from the US, it's turning to China, and it's giving China the ability to grow its industry with Russian funds, to grow its industry with Chinese funds, at a time when if you had just continued to provide these products, they would not be able to develop an industry because it would have priced their product out of the market. Their product would be too high and too poor quality to gain market share globally. But by sanctioning a bunch of countries at once, and then sanctioning China, what you have done is given China an opportunity to capture market share in these countries so that when these disputes are over, when they are resolved, and they all will be resolved, what will happen is China will have a vibrant chip building sector thanks to the United States and the Biden administration. China wants to insulate itself against Western sanctions. One of the things that they're doing is investing heavily in all of the areas that they are being curtailed from by the West. They're investing in chips. They're investing in cryptocurrency and in gold and insulating themselves from potential financial sanctions. They're investing in areas that will make sanctions irrelevant in the future. And it's not just China doing it. The entire global South is working day and night to sanction proof their economies, to sanction proof their military sectors and their technology sectors. Chinese firms are evading chip controls. So it's a combination of going around the sanctions, but it's also a combination of them trying to develop their own internal capacity using the fact that there are other countries that can only buy from them. So it's helping to create an economy of scale and helping them to undergird their own industries for the future. Quietly reducing its reliance on foreign chip technology. They don't have to be loud. They don't have to be boisterous. They don't have to make a lot of reports in the news media. All they're doing is quietly investing, quietly restructuring, quietly dollarizing, step by step. They are checkmating the United States. They are showing that they can do it without having to fire not one shot on the battlefield. China may be making more advanced chips despite U.S. sanctions, but it still faces big problems. When we look at this, one of the things that China has done is turn to Huawei. They've turned to their internal companies and they've undergirded those companies in an attempt to foster rapid growth in the sector of semiconductor production. And it's working. It's working because Huawei is putting out new products. SMIC could produce a 5 nanometer chips despite trade restrictions. So we see there, not only have they proven that they can do a 7 nanometer chip, but now they're moving towards the 5 nanometer chip. And when this happens, this will be a game changer. When they are able to produce internally 5 nanometer chips, when they are able to produce internally on large scale 7 nanometer chips, if they are able to produce the type of lithographic machines that would enable them to create their own production capacity in-house without the use of foreign technology, when they're able to do that, it's going to be a game changer, not just for the Chinese economy, but for the world. China on cusp of next generation chip production despite U.S. curbs. All the U.S. curbs have done is provided China additional markets because it has pushed countries together with no other alternative but to buy from China, but to be sourced by China. And these inferior products right now, or not next generation products that they are producing now, will give way to an industry that is cutting edge and second to none. Let me talk about the third, and this is actually the third, sorry about that typo. This is the third area that we need to talk about, and that's brinksmanship. China is checkmating the United States through brinksmanship. America must optimize forces to avoid losing a war with China, Air Force Secretary says. Biden, Xi agreed to increase military communications to avoid accidents. Let's be clear. China does not want a hot war with anyone. China has been very strategic in the use of their military force. They don't have a lot of bases across the world. They don't have a lot of military power that they're using to exert outside of their sphere of influence. And by doing it, by going this route, it is pressing the United States to continuously keep a significant presence of its military might in storage and in the Indo-Pacific. While China may not be directly engaged in the Ukraine war, China's pressure tactics in and around the oceans, the South China Sea, and in and around with Taiwan is helping the Russian war effort and is weakening the United States. It's weakening the United States because the United States has to consistently keep assets occupied, consistently retool for the possibility, not the action, just by maintaining the possibility that they could attack Taiwan. The United States has to keep troops there, has to fund these troops, has to continuously provide resources and logistics. It is spreading the United States. We looked at, we all watched what Iran and Israel went through with their conflict. And one of the reasons that I believe the Israeli conflict with Iran did not escalate is because the United States was in no position to support yet another heavy air defense conflict where the U.S. is required to send significant amounts of air defense missiles, constantly sending significant amounts of material and support and financial support to a second conflict in the world at the same time. And the reason, a large portion of the reason that exists is because the United States has to, at all times, keep a significant portion of its resources ready and on hold in the concept or the thought that China might attack Taiwan. And so it's pinning the U.S. down in a different theater. It's pinning the U.S. down and constraining the U.S. globally. It's constraining what the U.S. can provide to Ukraine. It's constraining what the U.S. can provide to Israel. It's constraining really what the U.S. can provide in any of these other theaters. It's a checkmate. It's a form of brinksmanship that enables China to weaken the United States without actually getting into a direct conflict. Because while the other theaters are hot, if China can continue to do brinksmanship, it is actually helping Ukraine, Russia, Iran. It's helping other nations, but it's also helping China inadvertently because it's weakening the United States and their global, the U.S. should never have taken on the responsibility of being the global policeman. No one country should have to fund, no one group of people should have to fund global security. Whatever the West plan was for global security, all of the nations should have had to contribute a significant portion. And I'm not talking about 2%. This notion that the United States is going to patrol the seas and the United States taxpayer has to fund for military bases all over the world, it's just it's just preposterous when you think of it, because what's going to happen, or what has happened, is that the U.S. has found itself overextended. The pressure tactics that China is employing is just enough to keep the tension on, to keep the U.S. military assets in region, to keep the U.S. assets from being able to sail to attack the Houthis and to deploy across the Middle East and to send the type of support that they would like to send, but they cannot because A, they don't have the production capacity, and B, they are on hold in this stalemate in the waters and in the lands and the islands that are surrounding China. The crisis in the South China Sea is not intended to be a hot war. All of the diplomacy of anger at Taiwan, all of that is, I think, strategic. a strategic decision made by the government in China to keep the pressure on, keep developing, keep the pressure on, and give Russia and others the opportunity to weaken the United States while China just waits and develops, builds new fighter jets, expands its navy. And the one benefit that China has is it's not trying to control the world. It's trying to control its own borders, its own sphere of influence. So you take the United States, while they invest a lot, they have great technology, they have a strong military, that military is spread out all over the world. China's military is spread out just around its borders. And so when you look at a conflict with China and the US inside of the sphere of influence of China, it is quite possibly that in the coming years and decades, the US will be overwhelmingly outpowered, just because the Chinese investment is domestic and designed for domestic defense, whereas the U.S. investment is for global imperialism. And so they've got all of these hot spots all over the world that they're going to have to defend continuously. And they will not be able to draw down in some of these places without those places flaring up. And so it's going to either require the U.S. to constantly and consistently pour money into defense sector while the people of the United States are suffering. The people of the United States are there's so many people in miserable conditions. And part of it is because the United States has taken a position that they are more concerned with global dominance and imperialism in many instances than they are with the well-being of their own citizens, the education of their children, the providing for transportation and adequate healthcare services, the providing for seniors and prenatal care and assistance to mothers and to college-age students. They've decided that it's more important to be the global policeman to protect the economic interest of the Davos crowd than it is to be a benefit to the citizens who pay the taxes. And by spreading their resources out, China is checkmating them because they see that the U.S. is overextended. And as the Chinese military continues to build and continues to focus just in its sphere of influence, it is going to be very difficult for the U.S. to keep up without pulling resources and pulling assets from other parts of the globe. And the moment they do that, what's going to happen is you're going to see that, hey, there's going to be consistent a deterioration of the global security framework, which is what you're seeing right now. You see Emmanuel Macron talking about a new nuclear arms race, a new deterrent, because they're seeing that, hey, the U.S. is overextended, is not capable of funding multiple conflicts solely, and the Europeans have not invested themselves into production and into the military capacity, so they're not capable. So they're turning now to this notion that we've got to expand the nuclear footprint because that's our only way to have a deterrent, which I don't know if it will be the deterrent that Macron and others think it will be. U.S. should avoid open armed conflict with China, top U.S. general says. An open armed conflict with China would be terribly draining. I'm not saying that China will win. China doesn't need to win. Long as China continues to expand its military and threat, the U.S. will have to keep pace in the region. And as long as the U.S. is trying to keep pace in that region, keep pace in Europe, keep pace in other places around the world, it's going to find itself in a situation where it is overextended. Remember, that's one of the things that led to the downfall of Rome. The overextension militarily, the trying to be the defense department for the entire globe is a very costly endeavor. It is a costly endeavor, so much so that all who have tried to achieve it ultimately collapsed. The Brits tried to achieve it. There are other nations that tried to achieve it, and the more they expanded too far and took on too much obligation and then had to borrow to sustain the obligation. Look at the United States debt. What happens as the U.S. continues to borrow? What happens as dollarization continues to take place? We are in turbulent economic times. We are going to be in turbulent waters as the days and weeks and months and years really pass by, because we're going to see, and I believe we're already seeing, a deterioration of the U.S. deterrent. And with that deterioration, the European allies are already getting antsy, and others will start to defect and choose different sides and alliances. And the Western hegemony that has been led by the U.S. will be under threat. And I wonder what will happen when the Davos crowd sees their grip slipping over the globe, over the resources of the earth. What happens when they find themselves in a situation where we enter a global economy that is true capitalism, where you cannot exploit and extort resources from Africa and other parts of the world, where you have to pay a fair price, where countries won't be toppled just because they won't give the economic advantage to Western companies, where those tactics no longer will be at play. What will happen to the West and how they will respond is still to be determined. Well, I thank you for watching. I want to ask you if you would share, if you would like, if you would subscribe to the channel. We appreciate all that you guys do to support us, and we appreciate you guys watching the program whenever you do. This is Money Matters Monologue. And I just want to thank you for watching and ask you guys to continue to watch our videos. As always, why swim against the current when you can ride the wave? Don't play the victim, play the game.